Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. We would like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation on which this podcast is produced. Today we are joined by consultant psychiatrist and author Dr. Mark Cross to discuss his latest book, Anxiety. Mark has worked in psychiatry for 3 decades and was first introduced to Australian viewing audiences in the landmark ABC docu-series Changing Minds. Anxiety is a subject Mark knows quite a bit about. Many of his patients are sufferers, which is hardly surprising given anxiety is the most common mental health condition in Australia, affecting up to 1 in 4 people at some point in their lives. But Mark also knows about anxiety from another perspective because he too has suffered from anxiety all his life. Welcome, Mark.
Yes, hello, welcome. Well, thank you for welcoming me.
So, as I mentioned in my introduction, anxiety is the most common mental health condition in Australia. However, anxiety is often underreported. Why is that?
So we have mental health surveys every now and then, and the figures mainly that are reported, say, in various websites or whatever, come from the 2007 survey, where 14% of Australians stated that in the previous 12 months they'd had some form of anxiety disorder. But of course, that was only five most common anxiety disorders. So, namely PTSD, generalized anxiety disorder, phobias, OCD, and of course, I'm always going to forget one, aren't I? When I list things, and social phobia. But it doesn't look at specific phobias. So it was only agoraphobia actually, and also it doesn't look. These sort of figures often miss people with more than one condition. So in my book as well, I've got narratives from people with very complex mental health conditions, such as bipolar and schizophrenia, who also have anxiety, and that's often missed. And as I said, there's specific phobias that are underreported. And often also when people talk about anxiety, people don't understand that anxiety is a disorder because they go, okay, well, everyone gets anxious, right? So what I'm feeling must be normal. Meanwhile, when you're getting horrible anxiety, fight or flight symptoms, when there's no exam or no external threat, then you may well have an anxiety condition.
Yeah, yeah. So you also mentioned in your book about rejecting that binary notion of strong and weak in relation to the perception of mental health. So not only for people with anxiety themselves, but also their significant others, family, friends, and co-workers. Unfortunately, a large percentage of people report negative experiences after disclosing, particularly in the workplace. Can you speak a little bit about your experience and what workplaces can do to support their employees and co-workers?
Sure, I mean, that whole binary notion, I don't like binary notions anyway. I like grays and in-betweens. And, that speaks to that. And it speaks to self-stigma as well. And of course, that's played out in my work with doctors and nurses and other clinicians hiding ourselves. And of course, I found it very difficult to talk about my own issues, which is essentially a mental health condition, right? And I quote now that I feel almost easier talking about my sexuality, and believe me, that was a long time in the making and coming, and it's added to my anxiety obviously, than actually having anxiety as a doctor, because it was seen as a weakness, or I still on one level perceive it as a weakness. Again, that self-stigma is so horrible. We were trained to be of sound moral character and not to share ourselves, because we had to always have a strong facade and way of interacting. And I think that's, you can translate that to a whole lot of jobs and organizations, and that's not really helpful. And it's a very difficult one whether you come out at work or not, actually, in terms of, hey, your sexuality, but also mental health condition. I was just saying I was talking at an IBM diversity webinar the other day for my friend heads the diversity program there. And there's a diversity awards luncheon for the LGBTQ community. I went to it a couple of years ago with my other hat on, the Rainbow Families Network that I'm a member of. It's amazing. All the luminaries were there, all the big wigs in town, giving bronze to platinum awards for diversity in companies, which is amazing as a gay man. But then I sat there as a psychiatrist and someone who, has his own mental health issues, and I went, we don't have that for mental health. People don't talk about these issues in the workplace. And I take it with a case by case basis with my patients and whether they do, come out at work. And I say come out, but, in terms of disclosing. Mostly I've had a good sort of interaction because you are, under Australian law, protected. You can't be discriminated against, but of course there are different ways you can be, obviously. The problem is, and you ask me what workplaces can do. Well, first of all, we can all start by being kind to each other. I mean, that's a nice one. It doesn't cost anything. And change has to come from the top. So when I give talks to corporates and whatever, which I sometimes do, mainly through friends or whatever, I always ask who the most senior person is in the room, because I can get away with it, right? So, you have the young staff, they're all, looking, because, hey, let's face it, any organization has hierarchy and they have rules. And if you have a psychopathic narcissist as your boss, your mental health in the workplace is going to be awful. It's very important. It's work health and safety. And so workplaces can put things in place like check-ins, flexible work hours, a great return to work flexibility when somebody's off, openness, because often people are told, oh, Mark's off. When he comes back, you can't talk about it. Meanwhile, Mark's at home absolutely worried sick about people talking about him, and then returning to work before he's well because he's run out of sick leave. And then, of course, people are looking and then look down at their desks, and it adds to his sensitivity and feeling of, difference and not being accepted. Because if you're off for a long period of time, you're either pregnant, you've got a broken leg, or you've got cancer, and everyone talks about that.
Yes. Do you think that perception is improving at all? Do you think those conditions are improving for people after they disclose? There's society's moving in the direction of being more accepting of people.
We are, and I think, on a positive, I have to be positive, but of course, people have different experiences. And I will say, though, it's difficult in the mental health world and the workplace because we're talking about anxiety and depression. So most people at work will have an anxiety, depression, stress, and anxiety. And people are more open about that now, but less so for the more severe end of the spectrum. And I think people with bipolar and schizophrenia, PTSD, they find it harder. And I think we have to open the conversation much more about that because people still have a lot of stigma about those sort of conditions. And of course, that raises anxiety generally. On a positive note, I have to say, I've been thinking about this in this time of COVID. A friend of mine phoned me the other day, and I won't use all the expletives he did, because he had a panic attack for the first time in his life. And he knew it was a panic attack, and he called me to help him through it. And I was glad that I could at the time. And he said, do you and people you treat go through this BS all the time? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm donating to SAN immediately. This is ridiculous. Because it's sad that people have to experience it in order to have understanding. But you know what? After this time, people, the government, whatever, think, and the Black Dog Institute are talking about a tsunami of mental health issues. Never mind about all the people already with mental health issues. And I think we have to talk about it more. We've had such movements there already. So whilst this has not been a great time for a lot of people, I think we need to learn from it. And I think, personally, our dialogue is going to shift. And we definitely can now talk more about it, which is really the way forward in order to reduce stigma and people's negative experiences.
Okay, I suppose it's one of the few positives that have come out of this situation. But in chapter 2 of the book, You go through some of the external risk factors for anxiety. Obviously, a lot of them are very relevant to the environment that we find ourselves in now. So, some of them that include loneliness, financial stress, and fear of terror and environmental disaster. And I'm sure COVID-19 and the lockdown and all the associated social implications. I don't think even you could have imagined that as you were writing this book. Can you speak a little bit about the impact of the current environment? I know we sort of touched on it in the last question, but just the impact on our individual and collective mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, of course, bringing out a book on anxiety at this time is very compelling. And I actually was asked whether I knew about it by one interview, and I said, us gays have been told that we can cause earthquakes. So, hey, maybe a virus is in my remit. But no. But again, it's dovetailed, and of course, a lot of anxiety is being felt by a whole lot of people now. I have used that term, hey, we're all in this together, but in fact, with a caveat, we're not all in this equally together. So it's wonderful. I'm in the mountains. My husband and I have gotten much better. Apparently, there's going to be higher divorce rates after all this. So that's been quite amazing because I've had time to sit and look at what's important. So again, those are the positive things. But domestic violence, alcoholism, increasing sense of isolation has been an issue and is still an issue with a lot of people. And we'll come to what I think we should do about that. But, staying connected and all those things are important. But external factors are going to play out further down the track. So it's not only just about dealing with COVID now, but it's the fallout. So I chatted to a director producer the other day. We're doing some little podcast thing, but he hasn't had paid work since February. I've got friends in the arts industry. One of the mothers of my children has had to go get a Centrelink payment for the first time in 30 years. She's an actress, and that's really affected her. People in retail and contracted businesses, it's going to be a very anxious time for Australia, where, we are a lucky country, but we haven't had a recession for over 30 years. So that's going to have impacts. And, in terms of other external things, again, I keep on saying this, and I really mean it though, we have to be kind to each other. So at least social media has been, I think, a bit kinder. But when you look at all these external things, that causes pressure. So, obviously in a more equal society, people are less likely to have anxiety and other mental health conditions. But we have to be aware of how we deal with each other. And we're all stressed. There's no doubt about it. There's a high level of stress. So for today, for instance, I had to put air in my tires. And of course, I didn't have gloves in the car, so I was getting something. I was using this paper towel to try and, not touch the metal. And then I touched the metal, and I thought, oh God, now I've got to go inside and use their, spray for my hand. And it's constantly with us. And that obviously is going to have a toll. And we've got to watch out because it plays out in road rage. It plays out in, fighting over toilet rolls and now maybe something else in the supermarket. We've got to keep that in check and just always, let's not get into what we should do now, but it's, bad, harsh words are enough to actually make someone harm themselves. So we've got to be so careful about how we interact, and those are the sort of some of the external things. Media has a large part to play in that. So as with mental health issues, people who suicide don't make the front page, but people who hear voices and go into the lion's den at the zoo do. And it's this constant, saying as a stigma watch, for instance, media watch. And we've got to be careful because that's what's portrayed. But I like to think that we are better than America. Well, that's not hard, I don't think. But, I have to say. But in terms of the percentage of us, I look at the marriage equality figure, and I always use that I think that's a good measure. So about 65 to 70% of us are decent, good, kind people. with our own stresses, and at times we snap and we say things we don't want to, and foot and mouth disease runs large with me. But at the end of the day, we are kind to each other, we look after our neighbors, we connect. But the problem is, in that 30%, you have such meanness and horribleness, but also, the shock value. That's what makes the news. And I think it gets skewed in its reporting because we must be doing something right in this country for us to have done so well comparatively. Apart from, obviously, we all want Jacinta as our Prime Minister.
Yeah. So you also mentioned in the book some sort of external measures people can undertake to help control their anxiety or the symptoms of anxiety. Can you suggest some lifestyle changes that may help to alleviate um, these symptoms? Just particularly in this climate of uncertainty and social distance.
Yes. So it's always good when you feel in control and what you can control. And really, you can only control you, right? So that's a useful one to remember when you wake up in the morning, do some gratefulness, stretches, and thinking. And of course, then reach for the coffee. Who can start without coffee, right? But exercise. And I must say, and let me be very honest with you, I say all these things: diet, sleep, exercise. On the one hand, we know what we want to do and we need to do, and then we have to adapt it to ourselves. So I don't want to sound as if I'm holier than thou because I've been eating chips and chocolate all the way through and loving it. But I've been walking and it's been wonderful. I've done more walking in the last 6 weeks than I have all year. And it just clears your mind. So when you're talking about mindfulness, and that underpins anything really that's useful, even drinking. And I've had a few wines here and there, as long as you do it mindfully. So what mindfulness means is just concentrating on what you're doing, concentrating on being, concentrating on actually staying in the moment, and then doing things in the here and now. And that's so beautiful when you just and concentrate on your breathing and just go, you know what, I'm not going to worry about what's going to happen in the future because that's useless. I'm not going to concentrate too much on what I should have done or regret what I've done yesterday because that's in the past. And if you go down those wormholes, there's no way out. And it's just sipping that wine or eating a nice healthy meal after your walk and go, hey, I can do this. And actually, you know what? This is something that I can really concentrate on and focus on. And at the end of the day, we're not asked to be better versions of ourselves, although, hey, if it comes out like that, that's great. At the end of the day, we've been asked to go to couch, not to war, and we've just had to endure. And it's been hard for people. But there is a way out. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. And just take day by day, structure, routine, and make sure you sleep.
I've got time for one more question. And this is a library podcast.
Yes.
Of course, you've mentioned in your book that you've been an avid reader of science fiction since about the age of 13. And you make some pretty interesting sort of comparisons between the more dystopian aspects of science fiction and modern Australian life. And obviously those comparisons have become a little less metaphorical in the last few weeks. But do you have any reading recommendations for people who may be spending a little bit more time at home at the moment?
It's funny. Yes, I mean, I'm in my 50s. I think you go through reading phase, and of course, in focus and attention in this time, reading a book. I mean, reading is the most wonderful thing, and it's the most wonderful, mindful thing that you can possibly engage in. But in terms of the science fiction, that dystopian stuff, of course, Margaret Atwood hates being called a science fiction writer. But I've been reading her since I was 16, and her Oryx and Crake series has stayed with me. Unfortunately, it's lodged in my brain. I can't get it out. It's so true to what's going on now in the world, and she writes so searingly and precipiently. I think that's a word. Presciently, that's it. And but Ursula K. Le Guin was so beautiful. And actually, a friend of ours knew someone who was writing an opera for her before she died on one of her earthy books. But Lord of the Rings, I just that's still my mainstay there. But what I'm currently reading is the new Hilary Mantel Wolf Hall trilogy, um, and the third one. And her book, A Change of Climate, is very evocative for me of colonial Africa, and she writes beautifully. And I've just also finished a trilogy by the writer of Altered Carbon. I don't know if you've seen that amazing show on
On Netflix.
Netflix. And he writes, his Tedeschi Kovacs character is this real straight pheromonal guy. But as Richard K. Morgan, he's just brought out a fantasy series called The Steel Remains with a gay anti-hero. And I suppose in my 50s now, and I've been, out, and I look for a lot of books with gay characters, positive LGBTQ or queer characters. Of course, when you search on Amazon, you come across all these male-to-male romances written by straight women who live in the Midwest with cats. It's incredible, and they write incredibly steamy sex scenes. They've obviously done their research well, but science fiction and fantasy is also gender bending, and apart from dystopian sort of stuff, Philip K. Dick is one of my all-time favorite authors. He's amazing, but it's also what our world could be. And interestingly, for your readers and listeners, Australasia features large and a whole lot of science fiction work as being an incredibly big and powerful block in the future world. It's very interesting, that part anyway, and we can do so much better as a country. I think we've got so much potential in Australia, and hopefully post-COVID we'll get there. So hopefully my reading will come true.
It will. And actually, I went to see Margaret Atwood recently on her recent author tour, and Oryx and Crake was actually written in Australia.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, there you go.
Was she using her machine? She's got a signing machine she invented.
I didn't actually. The queue was too long, but I probably would have.
Yeah.
I probably would have hung around if I had have known that.
I didn't know she was here. I would have. Really. She's one of my most, seminal authors that I've read through my decades.
Yeah, well, she definitely didn't disappoint. Next time.
Next time, indeed.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Mark. If you'd like to hear more from Mark, Anxiety has been recently published by HarperCollins and is available at all good local bookstores. Thank you for listening, and look out for more upcoming digital content through the UniWest Library What's On and social media channels.